J.D. Vance leaned into the microphone with that practiced political confidence. All I'm saying is, maybe it's time the UK stopped spending millions on museum pieces in red wool. The committee room went quiet. Not respectfully quiet, uncomfortably quiet. What Vance didn't realise was that the man he was dismissing wasn't a museum prop. He had served alongside US soldiers and had classified files in his satchel that could rewrite everything Vance thought he knew about ceremonial service. And in 30 seconds, those files were about to make a US senator wish he'd never opened his mouth. Now, before we reveal what exactly happened that day, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to see is the cost behind wearing that red uniform. Committee Room 4 had seen its share of dry mornings. Mahogany panels that had absorbed decades of bureaucratic droning, leather chairs worn smooth by politicians shifting through budget reports, an air that somehow always felt thick with the weight of important conversations happening very slowly. This Tuesday morning had started like any other. Charts about readiness thresholds, buzzwords like interoperability getting thrown around like they meant something. The kind of session where MPs check their phones more than they check the agenda. The US UK defence exchange was supposed to be routine. 10 minutes of diplomatic pleasantries, handshakes for the cameras. Vance was in London for a speaking circuit anyway. But then J.D. Vance walked in. He moved like a man entering his own campaign rally, not a joint military committee tucked away in the bowels of Westminster. His suit was sharp, his smile sharper, and his eyes were already working the room, not looking for threats, looking for opportunities. At the back of the room, exactly where protocol had placed him, Warrant Officer Samuel Kearns stood like he'd been carved from stone. The ceremonial dress of the Coldstream Guards isn't something you can wear casually. The crimson tunic demands perfect posture. The gold buttons catch every light in the room. The dark trousers with their single stripe create lines that have to stay sharp. And the stillness, that particular military stillness that most people mistake for decoration, has to be earned through decades of practice. Kearns had earned it. His hands were clasped behind his back, chin slightly lifted, eyes focused on a point somewhere above the committee table. He'd mastered the art of being present without being intrusive, of being seen without being noticed. He'd been told this morning would be routine, stand post, observe, maintain protocol. Most foreign dignitaries treated the guards with polite indifference. A few made jokes about the bearskin hats. None of them had ever looked him in the eye and told him he didn't belong. He didn't move when Vance entered, didn't shift when the senator's voice filled the room, didn't even blink when the conversation took its first wrong turn. "Senator Vance," the committee chair said, with the kind of forced enthusiasm that committee chairs specialise in, "we're honoured to have your insights today." "Appreciate it," Vance replied, already scanning faces, already calculating angles. "Always a pleasure to speak among friends." He wasn't supposed to speak long, 10 minutes tops. Standard diplomatic courtesy. But politicians like Vance don't get where they are by sticking to scripts. The first few minutes went exactly as planned. Vance praised the special relationship, used words like partnership in all the right places. Then someone asked about budget allocations. "It's fascinating how different our approaches to military spending are," Vance said. "In the States, we focus on capability first, tradition second." But then his eyes drifted toward the back of the room. "Before I begin," he said, gesturing toward Kearns with the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "can someone explain why we've got a Buckingham Palace extra standing guard at a budget hearing?" The comment landed with that particular awkwardness that happens when someone mistakes nervous laughter for approval. A few MPs smiled uncertainly. Others exchanged glances that clearly said, "Did he really just say that?" Kearns remained perfectly still. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement that he'd been addressed. But something had shifted in the room's chemistry. The comfort level had dropped just enough to be noticeable. Vance, sensing he had an audience, pressed forward. "I mean, no offence," he continued with mock diplomacy, "but we're talking about modern warfare here. Missile systems, electronic surveillance, forward basing, not scarlet coats and shiny boots." The pause that followed felt longer than it was. The room wasn't sure if this was meant as humour or something else entirely. Behind Kearns, a staffer whispered, "Does he not know who that is?" What they didn't know was that Samuel Kearns had been specifically requested for this assignment, handpicked by someone who thought his presence might remind certain American visitors that British ceremonial traditions weren't just for tourists. The irony was about to become apparent. The committee chair tried to clear his throat in a way that would redirect the conversation back to safe territory. But it was too late. The moment had momentum now, and Vance was riding it. "You know what?" he said, leaning back in his chair with growing confidence. "Let me be completely honest here. I've been watching this gentleman stand perfectly still for 20 minutes. Very impressive, very disciplined. But I have to ask, what exactly is he protecting us from? Aggressive tourists? An invasion of street performers?" A few stifled chuckles from the gallery. Not many, but enough to encourage him. "Because I've got to tell you, where I come from, we measure military effectiveness a little differently." The Defence Secretary's aide stopped taking notes and started typing something urgent into his phone. And then came the line that changed everything. "You don't belong in that uniform," Vance said, now pointing directly at Kearns with unmistakable intent. "If you wanted to serve your country, you should have been on a battlefield." The words hung in the air like smoke. A US senator had just looked a decorated British serviceman in the face during a formal parliamentary hearing and questioned his right to wear the uniform of the Crown. The camera angle shifted, cutting from Vance's satisfied smirk to the motionless figure at the back of the room. The contrast was jarring. One man animated and dismissive, the other silent and unmoving. But if you looked closely at Kearns's face, really looked, you might have noticed something subtle change around his eyes. Not anger, exactly. More like recognition. The look of someone who'd just heard something they'd been waiting years for someone to say out loud. Still, he didn't move. Dignity, he'd learned long ago, is never loud. And neither is fury when it's been properly trained. The room held its breath. MPs shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The press gallery leaned forward, sensing that something significant was happening, but not yet understanding what. And Samuel Kearns stood there absorbing the insult with the same steady composure he'd used to absorb enemy fire in places most of these people couldn't pronounce. But in his mind, he was making a calculation, weighing decades of disciplined silence against a moment that seemed to demand something more. The calculation came down on the side of truth. "All I'm saying," Vance continued, apparently interpreting the silence as validation, "is maybe it's time the UK stopped spending millions for museum pieces in red wool. You've got real soldiers sleeping two to a cot. Maybe we reassign some of the silent types to actual combat roles where they might do some good." A stifled cough from the corner, quiet shuffle of papers. Someone in the press gallery muttering something under their breath that sounded like "Christ Almighty." The younger MP who'd chuckled earlier was now staring at his hands, apparently having second thoughts about his reaction. Kearns remained motionless, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The energy, the posture of several MPs, the way people were looking at each other instead of at their notes. One committee member, a former military officer himself, was glaring at Vance with barely concealed outrage. Another had her phone out, clearly texting someone about what was happening. And then, after a pause so long it felt unnatural, Kearns moved. One step forward, just one. Left foot, then right. He approached the edge of the gallery with the kind of precision that comes from decades of measured movement, stopping exactly at the established boundary line. The movement was so controlled, so deliberate, that it commanded immediate attention. Every eye in the room shifted to him. A sergeant-at-arms nearby glanced toward the committee chair for instruction, unsure whether protocol was being followed or broken. The chair, looking relieved to have some kind of procedural guidance to follow, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. As a senior warrant officer, Kearns was permitted to request a verbal statement under conditions of mischaracterization, especially during formal testimony that had moved beyond policy into personal attack. Kearns remained still for another heartbeat. The room waited. Even the air conditioning seemed to have gone quiet. Then he spoke. "Permission to clarify the purpose of ceremonial service in a national defence context." His voice was calm, unhurried, English, but with that trace of Ulster steel that comes from growing up in places where choosing your words carefully wasn't just good manners, it was survival. Vance raised an eyebrow, still confident he was controlling the narrative, still thinking this was just wounded pride seeking a platform. Be my guest. The room braced for whatever was coming next. But what they got wasn't what anyone expected. Samuel Kearns began to speak not as a man defending himself, but as someone who had spent a lifetime standing guard over things most people never had to think about. His voice carried the weight of experience that couldn't be faked or performed. "I served in Northern Ireland," he said simply. 3 rotations during the later years. There were nights we didn't wear uniforms, not because we weren't proud of them, but because we couldn't afford to be seen. The words settled over the room like dust. No drama, no flourish, just fact. "I wore this same rank under Kevlar, not braid." He paused. Not for effect, but because old injuries sometimes made his breath catch when he stood too long. The kind of pause that spoke of pain carried quietly for years. "Later, I was stationed in Pristina, Kosovo. Post-conflict stabilization." His eyes never left the middle distance, never sought approval or sympathy from his audience. The only thing standing between a fragile peace and the next firefight was discipline, stillness, the ability to hold position without reacting. J.D. Vance wasn't smirking anymore. Around the horseshoe table, MPs had begun shifting forward in their seats, not to interrupt, but to hear more clearly. The casual dismissiveness that had characterized the morning was evaporating. After Kosovo came Afghanistan, Kearns continued. 2 tours, then Iraq, then places that don't appear on deployment lists because they were never meant to be public knowledge. Kearns glanced toward the committee chair with military courtesy, then back to the room. "There was a time I didn't need this uniform to remind people who I was," he said quietly. "But then came an operation in 2011, classified, resulted in long-term injury. I was reassigned to ceremonial duty, not as a demotion, as a continuation." Those last words landed with particular weight. Around Westminster, there were whispers about what that 2011 operation had involved: Kandahar, or protecting a diplomat during an attack. The file had always been sealed, and now here he was, standing in a committee room, being reduced to a prop by someone who'd never held a rifle, never stood a watch, never carried the weight of other people's lives in his steady hands. The committee chair leaned forward slightly. "Warrant Officer, are you able to provide any additional context about these assignments?" Kearns nodded once. "Some of it, yes, sir. Some of it remains classified, but enough has been declassified to address the Senator's concerns about the practical value of ceremonial service." Vance was beginning to look less comfortable. This wasn't going the way he'd anticipated. He leaned forward, trying to recapture the momentum he'd built earlier. "With all due respect, Warrant Officer, I don't doubt your resume, but I think it's fair to question the current use of elite manpower. We're not in 1812. The enemy has drones now, not bayonets." Kearns nodded slightly, acknowledging the point. "You're right, Senator. We're not in 1812. He let that hang in the air just long enough for people to wonder where he was going with it. Back then, when a soldier died, they were buried quietly. These days, they're buried with ceremony, with silence, and someone has to stand still beside their casket, long after the applause fades and the headlines move on. The room went completely quiet. "You said this uniform looks theatrical," Kearns continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling every corner of the chamber. "But I've stood through 219 funerals wearing it. Each one of them real, each name stitched into my spine, if not my file." No one interrupted. The committee chair didn't redirect. The press didn't rustle their papers. Even the air conditioning seemed to have gone silent. A younger MP in the second row, the one who had chuckled at Vance's first comment, now stared at his desk, looking like he regretted every assumption he'd made in the last 10 minutes. Kearns continued, his voice steady as stone. "I've stood post at Windsor Castle during a chemical alert drill the public never knew about. I held formation at Heathrow while your own Secret Service evacuated a US delegate." He paused, letting that detail sink in. "I've carried out threat postures behind the front-facing stoicism of a silent guard." He looked directly at Vance now. Not angrily, just levelly, with the kind of direct eye contact that comes from having nothing left to hide. You think standing still is weakness. I think you've never tried it under fire. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded with the weight of recognition. The moment when a room full of people realized they'd been witnessing something more significant than a policy disagreement. Behind Kearns, an aide murmured, "Is he going off record?" Someone else whispered back, "No, he's going on memory." The committee chair finally found his voice. "Warrant Officer Kearns, do you have documentation for these deployments?" Kearns gave a small nod. "I do." From the satchel at his side, he drew a black folder. MOD seal, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He didn't hand it over immediately, just held it, like he was making a decision about whether some things were worth revealing. "Senator Vance," he said, "when you question the value of ceremonial roles, you're not just questioning aesthetics. You're questioning what your own defense committees have signed off on for years." Vance's eyes narrowed. For the first time since entering the room, he looked genuinely uncertain about where this was heading. What's that supposed to mean? Kearns finally stepped forward and placed the folder on the table in front of the chair. The MOD seal caught the light like a warning. "I'm not here to posture," he said simply. "But if we're making records today, let's be complete about them." The committee chair took the folder with obvious reluctance, as if he suspected that opening it would change things in ways that couldn't be undone. Samuel Kearns stepped back to his position, resumed his stance, and returned to his silence. But the silence felt different now. Not empty, not decorative, loaded. The committee chair handled the folder like it might explode. His fingers traced the MOD seal before breaking it, and when he opened the file, his eyebrows rose almost immediately. He scanned the first few pages with growing attention, occasionally glancing up at Kearns as if to confirm that the man standing at the back of the room was the same person described in the documents. "This is," he began, then stopped himself. "This is quite extensive." After what felt like an eternity, he passed the folder to the clerk seated beside him. His voice was quieter now, more careful. "Read the first segment aloud." The clerk cleared his throat and began reading in the careful, measured tone that court officers use when they know the words matter. Subject, Kearns, Samuel James. Deployment, Kabul, Afghanistan. Year, 2010. Operation Asset Shield. Role, embedded security under provisional alias. Tasked with static and mobile protection of U.S. intelligence liaison during bilateral operation. Vance blinked. The word Kabul seemed to hit him differently than he'd expected. The clerk continued. Commendation issued from Joint Intelligence Command, United States Central Command. Incident report indicates the subject shielded a U.S. officer during a vehicle-borne explosive event, sustaining injury. Extraction handled under diplomatic immunity protocols. File declassified under Tier 3 transparency request, May of this year. There was no dramatic music, no gasps from the gallery, just the kind of heavy silence that settles over a room when people realize they've been arguing about something they didn't understand. Kearns hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to hearing his own service record read aloud. He stood exactly as he had before, hands clasped, eyes forward, breathing steady. One MP, who had been sceptical throughout the morning, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "This is the kind of stuff we're not supposed to know about." The committee chair adjusted his glasses and looked across the table. "Mr. Vance, do you wish to comment?" Vance leaned into his microphone slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. "Look, I didn't come here to disrespect anyone's service. That's not who I am." His voice had lost that practiced political cadence. "But I do believe in allocating defence funds responsibly, not theatrically." For the first time in minutes, Kearns turned his head, just slightly, just enough to make direct eye contact. "With respect, sir," he said, his voice cutting through the room's tension like a blade, "you didn't critique policy. You pointed at a man in uniform and said he didn't belong in it. There it was. Simple, direct, undeniable. And that uniform has been worn in war zones, on dignitary protection details, and in silence beside coffins draped in flags, both ours and yours." He took one step forward. "Not aggressive, just present. You called this theatre, But not every role in a nation's defence is meant to be loud. Some are meant to be seen, not heard. So the people watching remember what discipline looks like. Vance tried to regain his footing. I'm not arguing against symbolism, but when you dress up symbolism with budgetary weight, you risk funding optics over action. Kearns reached into his satchel again. This time he withdrew a thinner folder, also sealed with MOD markings, but with additional stamps that suggested higher classification levels. Then, maybe, he said quietly, we should discuss the times when optics and action were the same thing. The committee chair looked alarmed. Warrant Officer, is that file cleared for public session? It was declassified yesterday, sir, specifically for this committee's review, should the subject of ceremonial effectiveness arise. He placed the second folder on the table. Senator Vance mentioned asking the Pentagon. Perhaps he should read what they've already written. The silence in the room had weight now, physical weight. Vance was no longer leaning back in his chair. He sat straight, jaw working slightly, as if he was processing implications he hadn't anticipated. The committee chair opened the second folder with even more reluctance than the first. His eyes widened as he read. "Clerk," he said quietly, "please read the header classification and the first operational summary." The clerk's voice was steady, but you could hear the significance in his tone. Document classification, secret, declassified under Section 7 review, October 2024. Subject, Joint Operations Assessment, Ceremonial Security Protocol Effectiveness, Operational Theatre, Multiple, Assessment Period, 2008-2023. He paused, looking up at the chair for confirmation to continue. "Proceed," the chair said quietly. Summary. Review of 15-year period demonstrates ceremonial guard assignments have provided cover for 73 successful security operations, including 12 involving direct protection of U.S. personnel and assets. Assessment concludes that ceremonial visibility provides optimal camouflage for high-level protective details, as public expectation of guard presence eliminates suspicion of enhanced security measures. The room had gone completely still. Final recommendation. Continue and expand joint ceremonial operational protocols as cost-effective method of providing elite security coverage without revealing elevated threat levels to public or potential hostile observers. Someone in the press gallery dropped their pen. It clattered to the floor with what sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Kearns nodded slightly, acknowledging the reading. Then he delivered the line that would end the conversation. "Senator, you asked why I was seconded to your forces 3 times under that same uniform, and why I've never once broken formation until today." That last sentence hit harder than anything that had come before, because it wasn't pride, it wasn't performance, it wasn't even anger. It was permission. Permission earned through decades of silent service, finally used, not for self-defense, but for institutional correction. The committee chair cleared his throat. Let the record show that Warrant Officer Kearns' service includes joint operational contributions under US sanction, and that those contributions were acknowledged at the highest levels, even if classified until recently. One of the younger MPs added, not into his microphone, but audibly enough for everyone to hear, "I think we've all just been educated in the difference between spectacle and substance." Vance didn't respond. He sat straighter in his chair, but the words that had come so easily earlier seemed to have dried up entirely. His chief of staff, seated in the second row, was typing furiously into his phone. Damage control mode, obviously. Kearns looked to the chair with military courtesy. "Request to return to my position." The chair nodded. "Granted." Kearns turned, walked back to the rear of the room with the same measured pace he'd maintained all morning, and resumed the stillness he'd mastered decades earlier. The committee tried to move on to the next agenda item, something about procurement reviews, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. What had started as a routine hearing had become something else entirely. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but significant in ways that would be felt long after the minutes were filed. There was no applause, no fanfare, no victory celebration, but no more laughter either. Just the quiet recognition that sometimes respect isn't demanded, it's demonstrated. And sometimes the most powerful response to dismissal isn't argument, It's evidence. When the session finally adjourned, people lingered longer than usual. The atmosphere felt too heavy to disturb with quick exits. Kearns remained at his post as protocol dictated, not moving until the last official had left the chamber. Vance was among the last to stand. His team had gathered their materials quietly, occasionally glancing at him with expressions that suggested they weren't quite sure what had just happened or how to spin it. His communications director was already working her phone, probably calling contacts at friendly news outlets to see if there was any way to control the narrative. But even she looked shaken by what had unfolded. Instead of heading straight for the corridor, Vance took a detour toward the back of the room where Kearns stood, now half silhouetted in the dim overhead lighting. No audience remained, no cameras. Just two men from opposite ends of an argument that had grown heavier than either had anticipated. Their eyes met, not as adversaries, but as two people trying to understand what had just occurred. "I meant what I said, you know," Vance began, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier political polish. "What you did, those operations, that was real service, that was soldiering." Kearns watched him quietly, offering no help with the conversation. Vance continued, working through his thoughts aloud. "Which is why I still think this ceremonial post is beneath you." There was no venom in his tone now, just conviction, maybe even a kind of respect. "You've got too much experience, too much training to be—" He gestured vaguely at the red tunic. "Reduced to pageantry." Kearns finally spoke, his voice as steady as it had been throughout the entire morning. "I'm not reduced. I'm reassigned." He let that settle before continuing. "And I'm proud of what I do now, just as proud as I was in Helmand, or Kosovo, or Northern Ireland, because it's not the uniform that defines the soldier, it's the posture." Vance studied his face, trying to read whether this was conviction or just professional courtesy. "And besides," Kearns added quietly, "sometimes standing still is harder than running forward, especially when you're carrying ghosts." That one landed differently than the others. Vance blinked, something shifting in his expression, maybe understanding, maybe just the recognition that he was dealing with something beyond his experience. He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway, not quite ready to let it end. Without turning back, he said, "What a waste of potential." Kearns didn't flinch, didn't correct him, didn't offer any final words of wisdom or challenge. He just resumed his position, still, focused, watchful. Because there are men who speak to lead, and others who lead by how they carry silence. And sometimes, when a room rebalances itself, it doesn't happen through grand gestures or sweeping apologies. It happens in the moment when someone decides not to apologize for the space they occupy. Even when the world around them tries to question its meaning, even when a senator walks away still thinking he's right. Outside, the London rain had started again. Soft, relentless, and grey. The kind of weather that makes everything feel more serious than it did when the sun was shining. Inside Committee Room 4, Samuel Kearns stood alone among the empty chairs and scattered papers, maintaining the same posture he'd held for hours. Not because protocol required it anymore, but because some habits become more than habits when they've been earned through enough difficult days. The folders were back in his satchel. The questions had been answered. The record had been set straight. And tomorrow, he'd stand somewhere else, maybe outside Windsor, maybe at Wellington Barracks, maybe beside another flag-draped coffin, carrying the same quiet dignity that had just reminded a room full of politicians what service actually looks like. Do you think J.D. Vance was right that ceremonial roles are outdated distractions from real military work? Or did Warrant Officer Kearns change your mind about what standing still can mean when it's been earned through standing under fire? And if someone questioned the value of your uniform, or your silence, what would you say back? If this story made you think differently about the people in those red tunics, the ones you might walk past without a second thought, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Make sure you tap that bell icon so you never miss stories like this, because we bring you new Royal Guard stories every single day. Stories that show the real person behind the ceremony, the real courage behind the silence. And if you know someone who still thinks tradition has no place in modern defence, share this video with them. Let them decide whether stillness is weakness or something much harder to carry. Another incredible story is waiting for you right now. Just click the video on your screen. Same Tom, Same powerful storytelling, same eye-opening truth about what it really means to serve. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another moment that proves not all heroes make noise. Some just stand there and change everything.